All right, we have beat to death the ice canopy crystalline metallic hydrogen crystalline water sandwich composite that was up there on the earth creating an idyllic paradise for man to live in. But then now the approach was the worldwide flood destroyed all of that. That was done. Now, what does the worldwide flood indicate relative to the argument between creationism and evolution? It seems to support by far more powerfully the creation model, not the evolutionary model. Let's take a look at K14.htm. We have the period of the world flood, worldwide. If a worldwide flood was a reality, and scripture and physical evidence testifies that it was, then it supports a recent, designed, and orchestrated creation and answers a lot of questions which plague evolutionists. For example, evidence of a worldwide flood appears throughout the world, even on the highest mountaintops and mile-deep canyons. Often upper, later rock strata show supposedly much earlier life forms than lower strata, which contradicts the evolutionary models. The lower you go, the older you go. But corroborating the biblical creation flood model, for the ebb and flow of distant flood currents often deposited drowned life forms out of the so-called order of the evolutionary model simply because the flood currents came from further away, often depositing earlier drowned life forms on top of later life forms. So much for the geologic rock strata, which is not consistent throughout the whole world. In the Henry Morris's The Genesis Record, the world had not been annihilated by the flood, but it was drastically changed. As the Apostle Peter says, the world that then was being overflowed with water perished. When they left the ark that had preserved them through that year of God's awful wrath, Noah and his family truly disembarked on a new world. The ark had provided the bridge, seemingly fragile and easily demolished, from the old cosmos through the terrible cataclysm to the present cosmos, the heavens and the earth which are now. That's in 2 Peter. The lands that once had teemed with animals and people and lush vegetation had been replaced by a desolate wilderness. The air, which formerly was warm and gentle, now moved in stiff and sometimes violent winds, and there was a chill on the mountain slope where the ark rested. Dark clouds rolling about the sky, which had once been perpetually and pleasantly bright, seemed to threaten more rains and recurrence of flood conditions. At the same time, however, the earth had been purged of the wicked hordes that had made its physical beauty and only a mockery, and God had granted a gracious opportunity for a new beginning for the children of Adam. Some of the implied physical changes after the flood are as follows. The oceans were much more extensive, since they now contain all the waters which once were above the firmament and the subterranean reservoirs of the great deep. You see this in the continental shelves that drop off. The land areas, which were much less extensive than before the flood, with a much greater portion of its surface uninhabitable for this reason. The canopy top had been dissipated, so that the strong temperature differentials were inaugurated, leading to a gradual buildup of snow and ice in the polar latitudes, rendering much of the extreme northern and southern land surfaces also essentially uninhabitable. Mountain ranges uplifted after the flood emphasized the more rugged topography of the post-diluvian continents, with many of these regions also becoming unfit for human habitation. Winds and storms, rains and snows were possible now, thus rendering the total environment less congenial to man and animals than had once been the case. The environment was also much more hostile because of harmful radiation from space, no longer filtered out by the vapor canopy, or in this case we're talking about an ice canopy. resulting along with the contributing environmental factors in gradual reduction in human longevity after the flood. Tremendous glaciers, rivers, and lakes existed for a time, with the world only gradually approaching its present state of semi-aridity. Because of the tremendous physiographic and isostatic movements generated by the collapse of the subterranean caverns and the post-flood uplifts, the crust of the earth was in a state of general instability, reflected in recurrent volcanic and seismic activity all over the world for many centuries and continuing in some degrees even to the present. Such was not the case in the Paradise era. The lands were barren of vegetation until such time as plant life could be reestablished through the sprouting seeds and cuttings buried beneath the surface. There is even a possibility that the Earth's rotation speeded up by about 1.5% if the year was really 360 days long. So, scattered around on the land surfaces were occasional rotting carcasses and skeletons of the animals and people doomed in the waters of the flood, a vivid reminder of the ungodliness of the antediluvian world and the fate from which God had delivered the survivors. Since the new land surfaces probably had been formed mainly from the pre-diluvian seas filled with sediments and then uplifted, much more such remains were buried in the sediments beneath the land surfaces. Hence we have all these geologic discoveries. These sediments were rapidly being lithified through the eroded and dissolved cementing agents present in the waters that had deposited the sediments, thus becoming the great beds of fossil-bearing sedimentary rocks that are now found everywhere around the world. The fossils so preserved were not heterogeneously dispersed throughout the sediments, but were generally deposited in a certain statistical order, from the more simple marine and vertebrate organisms on the bottom to complex land vertebrates on the top. That has to do more with the sphericity and the density of the materials, which, generally speaking, the more complex organisms were less spherical and less dense, and the smaller, simpler organisms were more spherical and more dense, and they started the formation in the beginning in the geological order. This is in the order of increasing elevation of natural habitat, with fossil assemblages tending to be buried in association with the same ecological communities in which they had lived. Increasing ability to flee from the encroaching floodwaters was also a factor. And finally, increasing resistance to hydrodynamic forces and therefore an increasing tendency to be transported farther and deposited more slowly, less dense, more amorphous. Thus, in general, at any one locality, there would be a definite tendency for similar kinds of animals to be buried at about the same levels, and for different kinds to be buried in order of increasing size, complexity, as well as density and sphericity. Simpler you go, the more spherical, the less complex formed. This order is exactly what is commonly found in the sedimentary rocks, with many statistical exceptions, of course, as is to be expected of such catastrophic phenomena as were occurring during the flood, and thus clearly confirms the predictions based on the flood model as outlined in the biblical record. However, it has been deplorably misinterpreted by modern uniformitarian geologists to teach a gradual evolution of life from simple marine invertebrate organisms to complex land vertebrates through long geological ages. However, the Bible record explains that even better. Water, lots of water, sphericity and density. Evolutionists have arranged these supposed geological ages in a supposed chronological order, purportedly extending vertically upward through the geological column of sedimentary rocks deposited above the crystalline rocks on the bottom. The fossils found in these rocks, proceeding supposedly from simple to complex, comprise their best evidence for the theory of organic evolution. Thus, if the fossiliferous deposits are mainly records of the flood year, instead of millions of years of upward evolutionary struggle, the entire evolutionary system is scientifically bankrupt. There is little wonder, therefore, that the concept of the geological ages is defended with such fervor and that flood geology is ridiculed or ignored. But that gives the latter gives the better explanation. One should recognize, too, that nowhere in the world does the so-called geological column actually occur. It's in textbooks, not in real life. It is possible for any vertical sequence of these ages, or any portion of them, to exist in any given locality. Any age may be on the bottom and any on the top, and any in between. The contained fossils, rather than vertical superposition or any other physical features of the formation, constitute the controlling factor in the age assigned to it. Thus, the theory of evolution is assumed in building up the geological column, and then the latter is taken as the main proof of the theory of evolution. Circular reasoning. How old are the fossils? As old as the rocks are, the column. How old is the column? As old as the fossils are. Wait a minute. The fossils in this geological column, however, speak eloquently of death, and therefore they must have been deposited after Adam's fall and God's curse. Thus, both the biblical and scientific data, rightly understood, show that the Earth's great fossil graveyards must, for the most part, have been buried by the flood and its after effects. The record in the rocks is not a testimony to evolution, but rather to God's sovereign power and judgment on sin. Now, there's some argument, some contend that the flood was not universal. Essential to this question of the historicity of the early chapters of Genesis up through 6 is the question whether the Noahic flood was global or only regional. A worldwide flood would have cataclysmically changed the entire surface of the globe, including any fossil-bearing sedimentary rocks that may have been formed prior to that time. Consequently, the Earth's present fossiliferous sediments must date largely from the time of their deposition in the waters of the Great Flood. On the other hand, the modern evolutionary system of Earth history denies any such global cataclysm and is based on the assumption of uniformitarianism. You deny it, but you don't give reasons why you deny it. The sedimentary rocks and their fossil contents have been interpreted as evidence of a vast series of evolutionary ages extended over billions of years of time, deposited slowly and generally uniformly over the Earth as living organisms gradually evolved into higher and higher forms during these ages. The day-age theory is the attempt by Bible expositors to accommodate these evolutionary ages within the framework of the 6 days of creation, which they failed to do. The gap theory is the attempt of other expositors to accommodate them outside the framework of the 6 days of creation. Both such theories, if consistent, are associated with the local flood theory. Such a universal flood would have destroyed the sedimentary framework of the geological ages, of course. This is a universal flood precludes the historicity of the geological ages, and vice versa. It's one or the other. And unlike most Christians that try to put the two together, you can't. One obfuscates the other. If the Genesis flood actually was worldwide, then the strained exegesis associated with the day age and gap theories becomes unnecessary and harmful. If the tabulation below, therefore, are listed reasons why the flood should be accepted as a true global cataclysm. So we have a whole bunch of points that indicate in the Bible, especially Genesis, that the worldwide flood is the best answer to what Genesis and the Bible itself describes as conditions of the earth. Water above the atmosphere must have been global in extent. All these things, you can read them. Including all the other books besides Genesis. We have 100 of them, and probably counting more. We will continue with this next time.